A cold strip of light cuts across the doorway as he tells me to leave with a smile that isn't kind. The flickering bulb above us stutters like it's struggling to hold itself together, its jerking glow slicing his face into sharp planes that make him look half unfamiliar. I stand still for a moment, unable to distinguish whether the trembling inside my chest is shock or a delayed recognition of every sign I ignored. The air feels thin in this hallway, as if the house itself is holding its breath. His hand rests lightly on the edge of the door, too casual for the cruelty his words carry, and that small contradiction makes something cold press against the back of my throat. The smell of the night air pushes in from behind me, damp and metallic, wrapping around my arms, as if convinced I should already be outside. He doesn't say anything else. He doesn't need to. The flickering bulb keeps twitching overhead, tracing a nervous rhythm on my skin. I search his eyes for some anchor, some remaining softness, but all I see is a strange vacancy that makes me realize I've been living beside a man I didn't fully know. My voice tries to form something, an explanation, a protest, maybe even just my name, but it collapses before reaching my tongue, leaving only a tight silence squeezing between us. His smile widens slightly, like he's pleased with my inability to respond. And for a heartbeat, I think I see relief in him the way someone looks after finally dropping a weight they were tired of carrying. That hurts more than the words themselves. The edge of the doorway digs into my shoulder as I make myself step back, letting the night settle around me. I hear a faint hum from the bulb, a strained vibration that matches the pulse at my neck. Everything in me wants to rewind, to find the one moment that explains how we arrived at this threshold, where light fractures and truth slips through the cracks, but all I feel now is the cold acceptance that nothing about this moment is accidental. The street behind me is quiet, a stillness that feels staged, like the world paused to witness this private break. I notice his hand tighten on the door for just a second, a tiny pulse of tension betraying a thought he won't admit. My breath catches when I realize I'm not shocked by his dismissal. I'm shocked by how easily he seems able to do it. The quiet cruelty in his voice slices deeper than the smile he hides behind. He shifts his weight, impatient now, the light glitching over his shirt, as if the bulb wants to expose every flaw it can catch. I take another step back, and the night air folds around me more fully, drawing a boundary I didn't choose. My skin prickles as the glow from inside stretches outward, reaching me before pulling away again, whenever the bulb sputters. The sensation makes me feel like I'm caught between two pulses of reality, the life I thought I had, and the one he clearly stepped out of without telling me. I drag my fingers along the strap of my bag, grounding myself, the rough texture, a small reminder that I'm still here, still present even if everything feels unsteady. The door frame looms like a cut between worlds, and I can't ignore how the light falters right when my thoughts sharpen. He looks almost bored now, as if my hesitation inconveniences him, as if the ending of something that mattered to me is merely an item on his list. The strange thing is that his indifference gives me clarity, a spark of something steady inside the chaos gathering at my ribs. I exhale slowly, letting the cold air pass through me, letting it clear the remnants of whatever I was clinging to. The bulb flickers again, longer this time, and for a breath the doorway goes dim, leaving only his silhouette outlined in a restless shimmer. When the light snaps back, I see him narrowing his eyes, watching me, not with concern, but with calculation. It tells me he already planned this moment. It tells me I was the last to know. The realization lands with a clean, sharp weight inside me, settling in a place I didn't know had space left to ache. I understand now that his smile isn't a mask slipping, it's who he's finally allowed himself to be. My heartbeat steadies, strangely aligning with the uneven pulse of the bulb, and for a moment the world feels suspended by thin threads of light. I don't say goodbye. I don't ask why. I simply turn, letting the cold night fold me into its quieter truths. As I step away, the flickering behind me fades into a dull glow, but its fractured rhythm clings to my thoughts like a warning waiting to unfold. The doorway closes behind me with a silence that feels intentional. I'm Lauren Hale, 34, a compliance analyst from Portland, Oregon. The memory folds open in past tense the moment I picture the trembling key shifting inside my grip that evening, the metal catching a faint vibration I tried to blame on the cold instead of the unease that had already begun threading itself through my days. I remember pushing the key into the lock, feeling it quiver in a way that didn't match my hand, and the house meeting me with a silence thick enough to feel deliberate. The overhead light in the entryway was dim, pooling in one corner instead of filling the room the way it used to, as if even the house had learned to withdraw from me. I closed the door behind me, listening to the soft click echo against the walls, waiting for some sign of him, some greeting, some breath. Anything but the place stayed still. I set my bag down, noticing how my reflection, the one cast faintly from the glass cabinet beside the kitchen, looked stretched thin, and that was when the motif seated itself without my knowing, a thin reflection trembling on the surface. At the time, it felt like nothing more than a trick of light, the kind of fleeting distortion you ignore, because it seems too subtle to mean anything. I walked toward the kitchen, the echo of my footsteps strangely louder than usual, and noticed the dishes he said he'd clean were still sitting in the sink. The water long evaporated, leaving rings of residue at the bottom of each plate. That alone wasn't unusual, but something about the way things remained untouched made the air feel unmoved, as if he hadn't been home at all. A faint scent lingered near the hallway, his cologne, but off somehow sharper and more chemical than the warm cedar he usually wore. I stood there listening to the low hum of the refrigerator, the only sound grounding the moment. I called his name softly, not wanting to sound worried, but the quiet that answered felt intentional. My mind wandered to earlier that day, the curt tone he'd used on the phone when I'd casually asked if he needed anything from the store. He'd laughed that hollow laugh of his he saved for moments he didn't want to explain anything. I replayed it now, feeling it sting differently in retrospect. I went to our bedroom and saw the bedspread rumpled only on my side. His pillow untouched, the sheets on his half, smoothed over with a precision that didn't match his usual rush in the mornings. It was the kind of neatness that looks more like absence than effort. I caught myself pressing my thumb against my palm again, a nervous habit I barely noticed anymore, while wondering why the room felt colder than it should. I told myself he was working late, that traffic kept him, that I was imagining the tone from earlier, but that same instinct tugged at me, the one that had fired briefly when the key shook in the lock. I walked back into the kitchen to pour a glass of water, and as I lifted it, the faintest sound reached me from down the hall, a shuffle maybe, or something brushing against a doorframe. I hesitated, turning my head, waiting, but the sound didn't repeat. I let the moment dissolve and took a slow sip, the cool water settling a little too heavily in my chest. My phone buzzed once, a short message from him saying he'd be late. No explanation, no warmth, just a single line that made the entire house feel even emptier. His words were starting to feel like placeholders instead of truths, thin shapes filling the space where honesty used to live. I walked into the small office we shared and noticed a faint crease in the rug, as though someone had dragged a chair or shifted something quickly. I scanned the desk, trying to remember if I had left things exactly where they sat. Nothing looked overtly disturbed, but everything felt slightly off, like tiny misalignments you only see when you stare too long. I sat down and ran my hands across the desk surface, feeling the coolness of the wood, and tried to steady my nerves by pulling myself into work mode, focusing on the logic of tasks, the rhythm of familiar numbers. But even the glow from the computer screen felt foreign, casting shadows too long stretching across the walls in shapes that didn't match the stillness of the room. I tried to breathe slowly, but the air caught in my throat the way it does when something is wrong but refuses to declare itself openly. The house creaked once softly, a settling sound, but even that made my shoulders tense. I stood again, pacing lightly, listening, and in every quiet pocket of the house I felt a hesitation echo back at me, as though the walls themselves held their breath in anticipation of something I couldn't yet see. I checked the time, then his message, then the front door counting how many minutes had passed since I'd walked in. I didn't understand why I was keeping track, only that my body felt compelled to. I returned to the entryway, lifting the trembling key again, examining it under the faint light. I didn't see anything unusual, but its earlier vibration haunted me more than it should have. I placed it on the table and noticed immediately that it rolled slightly in the wrong direction, tilting as if nudged by an invisible disturbance. It was a small thing, but it tightened something inside me, a small tether pulling my awareness taut. The hallway light dimmed again, fading for a heartbeat before returning to its muted glow. I stood still, listening to the quiet unraveling around me, feeling the edges of a truth I didn't yet have the courage to face pressing gently but insistently against my ribs. Something in this house had already shifted, and I was only just beginning to feel the outline of its shape. The last thing I remember from that night is the sense that I wasn't alone in the quiet, not because someone else was there, but because something unsaid was. I found the slip on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day where nothing feels sharp until something cuts through without warning, and it happened when I reached into my father's old drawer, searching for a spare notepad. Instead, my fingers brushed a folded piece of paper I didn't recognize, its edges too crisp to have been forgotten long. I pulled it out and stood near the window, angling it toward the light, the glass reflections stretching my outline along the pane, as though even my shadow was trying to read over my shoulder. The transaction details printed across the slip, Ref ZL 470913, a location that didn't match anywhere my father would go, sent a faint tremor through my chest, the kind that whispers trouble before you know its shape. I told myself it was probably outdated, some old record that got shuffled in with loose batteries and dried pens, but the paper felt fresh, not softened by time. The numbers were clear, the ink unbroken, and something about that precision made my skin tighten. I pressed my thumb to the timestamp, trying to make sense of why a dormant card would show activity and why the transaction amount was so round, so tidy, like something placed intentionally rather than spent naturally. My father never used that card anymore. He barely remembered owning it. I stepped back from the window and called him. My voice kept casual, but the worry threaded through the words. When he answered and told me he hadn't touched that card in months, something inside me tilted slightly, a quiet recalibration of suspicion that I didn't yet want to name. I stared at the slip again, at the two clean edges, feeling it weigh differently in my hand now. I slipped it into my bag before I could second-guess myself, the impulse strong and immediate, as if my body understood more than my mind did. On the bus ride home, I kept catching my reflection in the window stretched across passing buildings, blurred by motion, and each time I saw it, the slip's presence in my bag pressed against me like a question I wasn't ready to answer. When I reached my stop, the late afternoon sun hit the glass panels outside the station, scattering reflections across the pavement, and for a moment the world looked fractured in the same way the truth was beginning to feel. I walked slowly, replaying my father's confused insistence that he hadn't used the card, trying to file the details somewhere it didn't belong. But my thoughts kept circling back to the slip's timestamp, 0913, and how it aligned too perfectly with a morning Mark said he was somewhere else entirely. I told myself it was coincidence, an odd overlap of irrelevant details, yet the possibility of connection slid into the back of my mind like a shadow, choosing where to settle. By the time I reached the house, I could feel a thin thread of unease tugging from somewhere deep, pulling tight, pulling steady, pulling toward a truth I wasn't yet ready to see. I remember the moment the day split cleanly in half, the part that came before and the part that came after, and it happened in the lobby of the downtown building where the afternoon light curved in long gold strips across the polished floor, catching on the metal railing near the entrance. Just enough to cast a metallic shadow, stretching toward me like a thin reminder that nothing in my world was as steady as it looked. I had agreed to meet Mark there because he said he needed to talk face to face, his tone clipped and efficient, the kind of voice he used when he wanted control over the narrative before it even began. I arrived 5 minutes early, my heart too tense to allow me to sit, so I stood near the edge of the lobby pretending to check my messages while watching the stream of employees pass through the security gates. The metallic shadow shifting across the floor seemed almost alive, inching closer whenever the sun hit the railing at just the right angle, a strange omen that made the hairs on my arms lift in a way I couldn't explain. I saw him before he saw me, his stride smooth, his expression unreadable, the kind of calm he wore when he wanted to appear rational, composed, untouchable. I opened my mouth to greet him, but before I could speak, Jessa from my department called my name, waving as she walked toward me, her phone still in her hand, and her expression bright with recognition. She was mid-sentence when her eyes flicked past me toward Mark, and something in her face changed, a tiny pinch of confusion, or maybe recognition that made her step slow. She nodded politely to him, but her eyes lingered on the phone in his hand, and in that single second the screen of his device lit up with a notification he didn't notice or didn't know she had seen. I didn't understand her expression at first, just the quick widening of her eyes, followed by a sharp inhale she tried to disguise as a cough, but her reaction buried itself in my mind even before I looked at him again. He gave her a stiff smile, the kind he offered when he didn't want to be bothered, and said my name in a tone that felt like a warning concealed in plain speech. I stepped toward him, trying to ignore how my pulse sped at the way he angled his body as if shielding the phone from view, a gesture too small to accuse outright, but too deliberate to ignore. The metallic shadow stretched across the polished floor as a group of people walked by, distorting briefly over their legs and then settling again at my feet like it was waiting patient and cold. He asked if we could talk somewhere quieter, but his eyes darted toward the phone again, and I caught the blue-white glow of the screen, reflecting faintly against the metal railing. I didn't know why that bothered me so sharply, but it did, as though the reflection itself pointed to something I wasn't supposed to see. I agreed to step aside with him, but as we moved, Jessa's hand brushed my elbow lightly, stopping me just long enough for her to whisper, "Are you okay?" in a tone that suggested she already doubted the answer. I forced a smile and said I was fine, but her gaze flicked again toward Mark's pocket where the phone was now half tucked away, screen still lit from the recent notification. She hesitated as if deciding whether to tell me something, but the hesitation was brief. Mark turned back sharply. his expression tight, and she stepped away with a quick nod. Though I could still feel her unease hovering between us. When he and I moved toward the quieter corner of the lobby, the metallic shadow trailed us across the floor, catching glimmers of light that fractured across the tiles like small warnings. He began speaking before I could gather my thoughts, his words clipped and defensive, claiming he was tired of questions, tired of feeling monitored, tired of assumptions, and every sentence felt painfully rehearsed, polished into something that sounded reasonable enough to hide the sharp edges beneath. His voice carried just enough to draw a few glances from people walking by, and I felt heat rise in my face as the public nature of the moment tightened around us. I tried to keep my voice low, calm, asking what he meant, why he sounded like I had wronged him instead of simply asking for clarity in recent days, but he pushed back harder, each response sharper than the last. Then it happened, the moment I wish I could erase from my memory the split-second flash of truth that pierced the entire conversation. Jessa's voice came from behind us, soft but urgent, saying my name again. When I turned, she wasn't looking at me. She was staring at Mark's phone, which now displayed a screenshot thumbnail on the lock screen, the image unmistakable. Even from a distance, a bank app screenshot showing transaction AC19 with a timestamp that contradicted the explanation Mark had given me earlier in the week. The notification preview still hovered on the screen, framed by the faint light bouncing off the nearby railing, the metallic shadow flickering as though reacting to the sudden shift in tension. I felt my stomach twist, not because I fully understood the implications yet, but because he immediately shoved the phone deeper into his pocket, his jaw tightening so sharply the muscle jumped beneath the skin. Jessa's eyes met mine, and though she didn't say a word, the apology in her gaze was immediate and overwhelming. The lobby felt suddenly too bright, too loud. Every sound amplified footsteps slapping the tile, the low whir of the security gate, someone laughing near the elevators, all of it pressing against me as if the world wanted to ensure I didn't miss a single detail of the humiliation spreading through my chest. I asked him quietly but firmly what the screenshot was, what the notification meant, why the timestamp didn't match what he'd told me, but he snapped back with a dismissive wave, claiming it was irrelevant, a mistake, something taken out of context. The more he deflected, the more the metallic shadow seemed to stretch and curl around his feet, the long, dark shape trembling just slightly as though mirroring the tremor in my hands. People had begun to notice. A few glanced subtly in our direction, not enough to stare openly, but enough that I felt exposed in a way I couldn't control. He lowered his voice only to hiss that I was making a scene, accusing him unfairly, twisting details to fit some paranoid narrative, and the cruelty in his tone sliced through my composure with surgical precision. But the moment that broke something quietly inside me wasn't his anger. It was the way he smoothed down his shirt afterward, pretending calm, drawing himself up with manufactured dignity, as if trying to reclaim the upper hand while ignoring the proof glowing moments earlier on his screen. I realized then that the truth mattered less to him than the performance of control. Jessa took a half step closer, her voice hesitant as she said softly, "Lauren, I think you should look at the screenshot when you can." Mark shot her a glare so cutting it made her flinch, but even that didn't erase the glimpse of fear or guilt in his expression. I tried to steady my breathing, but everything felt like it was shaking not visibly, but deep in the places where certainty used to live. He took a step back, telling me he was leaving, that he didn't have time for accusations, that he wouldn't tolerate being cornered, twisting the situation so deftly it made my head spin. Then, without waiting for a response, he turned and walked toward the exit, the metallic shadow pulling with him until the sunlight shifted and snapped it away. I stood frozen, where he left me, the echo of his voice still cutting through the space he'd occupied, and for a long moment all I could do was stare at the place where the shadow had been and, feeling something fragile inside me, begin to crack under the weight of a truth that no longer cared about staying hidden. I didn't go straight home after the scene in the lobby. I couldn't. My hands were still trembling too badly, my thoughts too jagged to settle into anything that resembled coherence, and the memory of the metallic shadow clinging to Mark's feet kept looping through my mind like a warning I had failed to hear soon enough. By the time I walked through our front door, the house felt hollowed out as if every sound had been drained from the air, leaving only a thin layer of tension coating the walls. I dropped my bag on the chair and stood in the entryway for a long moment, waiting for the silence to shift, for the house to give me some sign of what it had witnessed in my absence. But nothing moved, nothing breathed, nothing acknowledged me. The quiet felt staged too perfect, as if it were trying to behave. I moved toward the bedroom, my steps careful as though something fragile might crack beneath me if I walked too quickly. The drawer caught my attention before anything else, a half-open drawer in the dresser pulled out just far enough to be wrong. It wasn't wide enough to be obvious from across the room, but it was enough to slice through the stillness with that nearly imperceptible accusation someone had been here. Someone had looked. Someone had touched. I approached it slowly, my pulse thudding in a rhythm too steady to match the storm in my chest. The drawer looked out of place not because it was open, but because it had been left in a way that pretended not to be. Careless would have been wide, obvious a mess. But this was the kind of quiet intrusion that suggested someone had taken what they needed, then tried to erase the evidence by almost but not quite returning things to normal. My fingers brushed the edge of the drawer and I felt how cold the wood was, how unnaturally chilled it seemed compared to the rest of the room, as if something had lingered there long enough to drain warmth from the air. I slid it open the rest of the way, the motion too smooth like the drawer had been opened several times recently and had learned the path. Inside were folded documents, old papers, forgotten receipts, a few envelopes, and beneath them all a stack of financial printouts I didn't remember placing there. My breath tightened. I lifted the top sheet, and there it was printed in clean black ink, alert code 511R timestamped 1402, evidence number 3, the internal system alert from my workplace that should never have been in this house. The alert outlined irregular activity patterns, mismatched withdrawals, and timing inconsistencies, each point underlined by the automated system as if highlighting its own distress. I felt my stomach drop, the paper trembling in my hand despite my effort to hold still. This wasn't something I had brought home. This wasn't something my father would have saved. This was something that had been moved, taken, copied, placed. Mark had accessed something he shouldn't have. Or someone had given him access. Or he had found a way in. The thought made my throat tighten and the room seemed to tilt slightly as though it were reacting to the realization along with me. I spread the papers across the bed, scanning each line while my thoughts spiraled in growing circles of dread. Some of the timestamps matched the morning of the transaction slip I'd found earlier. Others lined up with nights Mark claimed to be working late. But the one that froze me was the entry matching the morning he had promised he was out buying supplies for a project. He had been nowhere near where he said he was. My heartbeat grew heavier and slower, each beat sinking like a weight inside my chest. The air in the room thickened cold at the edges, and I felt the kind of clarity that doesn't comfort, only confirms. I reached for another sheet and saw the same alert code repeated, the only difference being the sequence of transaction attempts and the lengths of the unauthorized queries. He hadn't just stumbled into this. He had returned to it multiple times. My hands pressed against my temples as I tried to contain the rising panic. The drawer gaped open behind me like a mouth mid-confession, its half-open posture suddenly making perfect sense. Mark hadn't cared enough to hide the evidence well because he didn't believe I'd ever look. Or he didn't believe I'd understand. Or maybe he had wanted me to see it eventually, but on his terms at a timing he could control, so that even the truth would feel like something he had curated. The realization wounded something deep in me. I stood and paced the length of the room holding the alert sheets, like they were lifelines and weapons at the same time. I kept hearing his voice from the lobby, sharp, defensive, cruel, and the way he had looked at me as if he were already rewriting the truth to suit whatever story he needed next. The half-open drawer felt like a message he had left unintentionally, a detail too small for him to consider important but large enough for me to follow, like a breadcrumb laid in a trail of lies. I picked up my phone and called him, my voice steady in a way that startled me. The call rang twice before he answered, and his tone was instantly irritated, as though my voice itself was an inconvenience. I asked him directly if he had been in our room. He said no. I asked if he had taken anything from the drawer. He said what drawer? I asked if he had gone through my work documents. He laughed sharply, hollowly, like the idea was absurd, like I was absurd, and the sound cut through me more painfully than the lie itself. I hung up before he could turn the conversation into another performance. The silence that followed was dense enough to feel like a physical presence pressing against my skin. I sat on the floor, the papers fanned out around me like a constellation of truths I didn't want to map, but my mind was already connecting the points. The internal alert pattern lined up with his movements in ways that were too precise to ignore. The half-open drawer proved he had been looking for something. The slip from my father's drawer was no longer just an odd detail. It was a piece of a plan he had set in motion long before I realized anything was wrong. I stared at the drawer, at the papers at the door, at the cold air shifting around me as though the house exhaled in sympathy. Something in me cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but cleanly, the kind of fracture that comes after too many small pressures accumulating in silence. I realized I could no longer pretend confusion was coincidence, or that Mark was careless instead of calculated, or that the inconsistencies in his stories were misunderstandings rather than deliberate misdirections. The truth had widened enough to let itself be seen. And sitting there on the bedroom floor with the half-open drawer watching me like an unblinking witness, I understood something I hadn't wanted to say aloud. Mark wasn't hiding mistakes. He was hiding patterns. Each paper in front of me was a piece of him I had never met, and all of them together formed a version of him that terrified me in its cold precision. The drawer wasn't left open by accident. It was left open because he didn't think I'd ever open it far enough to find him inside it. I didn't sleep the night after finding the alert sheets in the half-open drawer. My mind kept circling the same impossible loops, tracing timelines and inconsistencies, until the patterns blurred into something sharp enough to sting every time I blinked. By morning, the air in the house felt stale, as if hours of pacing had wrung the oxygen out of each room. I knew I couldn't ignore the growing knot in my chest, the one that tightened every time I thought about the slip from my father's drawer and the way Mark had deflected in the lobby, so I left the house with a purpose I didn't fully understand yet. I headed toward the ATM he claimed to have used that week, the one he mentioned casually, while stirring his coffee like it was just another forgettable detail in a conversation he controlled. The building that housed the machine sat on the corner of a busy intersection, its glass front catching the morning light in fractured angles. As I approached, I felt the coldness of uncertainty settle against my spine, but I pushed the door open anyway, my fingers closing around the cold doorknob, the object's chill seeping into my skin with a clarity so sharp it almost steadied me. The lobby inside had that sterile brightness banks favor the kind that makes every shadow too defined, every surface too reflective, and for a moment I saw myself duplicated in the polished floor tiles, the fragmented reflections reminding me how easily truth can split when handled without care. I walked to the ATM console, the machine humming quietly, its screen bright with idle readiness. I inserted the reference request I had printed earlier, hoping to confirm the withdrawal Mark insisted he made at a specific time. My breath held itself still while I waited for the internal system to load. When the slip printed the thermal paper warm between my fingers, a prickle ran down my arm. Machine ID A709, timestamp 0317. My vision narrowed slightly, my pulse thudding in my ears. He had claimed he was there mid-morning, confidently, casually, with no hesitation. But the timestamp contradicted everything he'd said. It wasn't even close. And it wasn't a mistake. You don't confuse 3 a.m. with 10 a.m. I stared at the numbers, each one cutting deeper the longer I looked. 0317. 0317. 0317. A time when he was supposed to be sleeping next to me. A time when the neighborhood was silent. A time when no one leaves the house without waking someone unless they've practiced leaving quietly. My thumb pressed harder into the slip as if pressure alone could force the truth to flatten into something easier to hold. But the truth only grew sharper. I stepped back, needing air, needing space, needing something that didn't feel like lies pressing against my ribs. The door chimed faintly when I pushed it open, the street waking with early traffic. As I stood on the sidewalk, fractured light from passing cars cut across the slip, slicing the timestamp into bright, jittering segments. The motif echo took shape in that moment, uninvited, and unavoidable fractured light cuts across the timestamp slip, reminding me of the thin, trembling reflection from the night I had first noticed the shift inside the house. It was as if every truth was choosing its own way to be reflected back at me, each version fractured but still undeniable. The wind tugged at the paper and I held it tighter, feeling the weight of what it represented settling deeper into my chest. I walked a few steps along the sidewalk, trying to breathe evenly, though each inhale felt strangled by the realization forming in pieces inside my mind. If Mark had lied about the morning withdrawal, then the slip wasn't an isolated inconsistency, it was part of a larger pattern. And patterns don't form by accident. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I flinched, my nerves stretched too thin. When I looked at the screen, it was a message from Mark. "Where are you?" No warmth, no concern, just the bare demand of a man trying to keep control of a narrative he sensed slipping. I typed back a simple "out." Then I stopped myself from adding more. Explanations were currency, and I was beginning to understand that every one I offered became fuel for his manipulation. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and continued walking until the noise of traffic softened and the city blurred around me. I thought about the drawer, the alert codes, the slip from my father's card, the lobby scene, the look in Jessa's eyes, the worry she had attempted to hide. All of it clattered inside me like loose coins rolling across a hard floor. I found myself drifting toward the small park beside the river, where the air always smelled slightly like moss, and the world felt slower, quieter, easier to decipher. I sat on a bench gripping the slip in one hand while staring at the water drifting by in long, lazy currents. The morning light danced across the river in broken shards, and it was impossible not to notice how every reflection seemed fragmented again, as though the universe itself was conspiring to show me how truth bends when illuminated. I couldn't shake the feeling that this 0317 timestamp didn't just contradict Mark's story, it connected to the old card slip from my father's drawer. 2 pieces of evidence, 2 lies, 2 moments that should never have touched yet, now seemed to be mirroring each other across the weeks. My pulse quickened as the realization threaded itself together. Mark had been awake at 3 a.m., and the old card had been used at 09:13 on a morning he also couldn't account for. These weren't coincidences. These were movements deliberate, precise, hidden. My mind flashed back to the trembling key in my hand, the uneasy shiver of the house the night he said he'd be late, the cologne that smelled sharper than usual, the creased rug in the office, the drawer left not quite closed. All the moments I had dismissed as stress or exhaustion or bad luck aligned with sudden brutal clarity. I rose from the bench, my legs unsteady but determined because the truth wasn't something I could outrun anymore. I needed answers. Every piece of evidence pointed to something larger than betrayal. It felt like strategy. I walked until my steps steadied, each one more firm than the last, each one guided not by fear but by the grim certainty forming inside me. By the time I reached the street again, the city no longer felt overwhelming. It felt like a map I could finally read. I checked the slip again. 0317. Machine ID A7U9. That number made something click in my memory. A late-night system alert at work flagged activity on that particular machine weeks ago. I had dismissed it as a random glitch. But now I realized I had seen the pattern before even knowing it mattered. My chest tightened with a mixture of dread and reluctant clarity. I headed toward home with the slip clenched in my fist, knowing that the moment I stepped through that door, something fundamental would shift inside me. And when I finally turned the knob, still cold from the morning air, the house greeted me with that same unnatural stillness, as if it had been waiting for me to bring the truth inside. The ATM slip didn't just contradict his story, it connected him to the one place he swore he'd never touched. I walked into the office the next morning with a heaviness that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from the weight of knowing too much and not enough at the same time. The sky outside was a dull gray, the kind that makes the world feel slightly out of focus, and every reflection in the building's glass entrance looked smeared as though reality itself hadn't fully settled for the day. My steps echoed in the hallway, sharp and hollow, and each sound reminded me that the truth I now carried had started to hollow something out inside me too. I made my way toward the compliance wing, trying to maintain a normal pace, trying to look like someone who wasn't unraveling from the inside out. The moment I reached my desk, I saw the light on my phone blinking. A message from Mr. Calder. "Please, come to my office when you arrive." My stomach tightened. The only reason a manager would call for me directly after a meltdown alert was if something had escalated far beyond normal protocol. I told myself that this meeting would simply clarify the inconsistencies, confirm what I suspected, maybe even explain something I hadn't yet considered. But a deeper part of me, the part that had learned to notice trembling reflections and mismatched timestamps, knew better. When I arrived at Calder's office, the door was half open, and the cold fluorescent light inside cast a pale stripe across the hallway carpet. He looked up from his monitor as I stepped in, his expression a careful blend of concern and professional neutrality. "Close the door, Lauren," he said quietly. I did. My fingers brushed a stack of papers on the nearby side table, and the edge sliced a thin line across my skin object number 7, the paper edge cutting my finger with a sting so small, yet so precise it felt symbolic of everything happening in my life. I pressed my thumb against the small cut, watching a bead of red rise as Calder gestured for me to sit. "I'm going to need your full attention," he said, his tone grave in a way that made my breath catch. He turned the monitor toward me slightly. The screen displayed a set of internal logs, patterns of activity access, timestamps, login attempts, audit trails, and then I saw it. Statement ID W22, evidence number 5, Jessa's written account. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt, the edges softening, as though the truth had grown too heavy for the space to hold it. Calder folded his hands, watching me carefully. "Your coworker provided this statement yesterday afternoon," he said. "She witnessed irregular activity on someone's device that directly intersects with the meltdown inquiry." My pulse spiked. I tried to swallow. Whose device, I asked, but the question was unnecessary. I already knew. Calder exhaled slowly. "Your husband's." My shoulders stiffened. The air in the room thickened. He tapped the screen, highlighting the part where Jessa described the bank app notification she had seen on Mark's phone. The same screenshot that had appeared in the lobby, the timestamp, AC-19, that contradicted Mark's story. She wasn't certain what she saw at first. Calder continued, but after the meltdown investigation began, she realized the notification matched the patterns we'd flagged earlier. I nodded numbly, my throat tightening. He slid a printed packet toward me. "This is her formal witness statement." I lifted the pages, reading the neat lines of text, while blood from the small paper cut slowly streaked along my finger. Jessa had written exactly what she saw. The notification, the timestamp mismatch, Mark's reaction, the tension between us, the detail about him trying to shield the phone from view. Every sentence felt like a spotlight aimed directly at the truth he had spent months burying. Lauren Calder said softly, "This is serious. Very serious. And I need to ask you something difficult." The way he said it made my breath falter. "Did you ever grant your husband access to internal files, systems credentials, anything he could have used to manipulate or monitor internal data?" The question hit like a blow. I shook my head quickly, the instinctive denial rising from a place deeper than thought. "No," I whispered. "Never. I would never do that." He watched me for several long seconds, weighing the sincerity of my voice, and finally nodded. "Then someone accessed your things without permission. And that puts you at risk too." Those words sent a cold spike through my spine, settling deep. At risk. At risk. The phrase clung to me like a static charge. I remembered the half-open drawer, the alert sheets, the messed carpet, the phone message that felt too timed, the 0317 ATM slip, all of it twisted into a moment of clarity so intense I felt physically lightheaded. Calder continued explaining how the meltdown had triggered a deeper audit, how certain account linkages had surfaced that made no sense unless deliberate manipulation had taken place. The problem, he said, lowering his voice, is that some of the transactions trace back to your father's dormant card, and that puts you directly in the chain of inquiry whether you knew about it or not. I closed my eyes for a moment, fighting the dizzying wave of disbelief. My father. He doesn't use that card anymore. I murmured more to myself than to Calder. He barely even knows where it is. Right, Calder said, which means someone else used it. Someone with access. Someone in my house. Someone who had touched my drawer. Someone who left the false sense of stillness in the air at night. Someone who had learned how to leave quietly at 3:17. My hands trembled slightly as I placed the witness statement back on the desk. Why would he do this? I asked, though the question felt naive even as it left my lips. Calder exhaled through his nose, not with impatience, but with the weight of a truth he couldn't soften. Money, he said. Power. Access. Or fear. People will do anything when they think they can get away with it. His words echoed in the space between us, settling into the cracks where my understanding had already begun to break. He leaned forward. I need you to be honest with me, Lauren. Has anything awful happened in your home lately? My breath caught. Images flashed in rapid succession. The trembling key, the half-open drawer, the sharp cologne, the stillness in the bedroom, the faint shuffle behind the hallway, the slipped rug, the slip in my father's drawer, the reflection trembling on the surface of the cabinet, the metallic shadow curling around his feet. Yes, I whispered. Several things. And I told him. Quietly. Carefully. Plainly. Every detail. When I finished, Calder's expression had hardened with concern. You need to be careful, he warned. If your husband is involved, he may already suspect you're connecting the dots. The room felt colder. My hands felt colder. Even the air tasted sharper. I stood slowly gathering myself as though my bones had to remember how to bear weight. Calder walked me to the door but stopped just before opening it. Lauren, he said quietly, for your own safety, don't confront him yet. Wait until we know more. I nodded, though uncertainty pooled inside me like a heavy shadow. As I stepped into the hallway, I felt the sting of the paper cut pulse with my heartbeat, a thin line of red against my skin, a warning drawn in the smallest measure of blood. The moment I left Calder's office, I realized I wasn't simply uncovering a truth. I was stepping directly into its path. I didn't plan to be awake when the truth finally reached for me, but some nights refuse sleep the way some wounds refuse air, and that evening, every corner of the house felt too silent, too rehearsed, too carefully arranged to let my mind rest. I sat curled on the far end of the couch, the only light coming from the dim lamp in the corner, and the faint glow from the street outside filtering through the half-closed curtain. I kept replaying the conversation with Calder, the weight of his voice when he told me not to confront Mark, the cold knot forming in my chest, when he said I might already be in danger without realizing it. Each thought looped against the next, until the hours blurred, and I could no longer tell whether the heaviness in my ribs was fear or clarity. The house creaked once a small, settling sound, but it made every nerve in my body tighten because now I knew how easily silence could disguise movement. At 11:47 p.m., my phone vibrated on the coffee table, the sudden noise slicing through the room like a blade dropped onto tile. I jolted upright, heart pounding, staring at the screen as it lit up with an unknown number. No name, no label, just a stark string of digits. For a moment, I thought it might be Mark in one of his calculated attempts to monitor my reactions, but the number wasn't his. With a trembling breath, I answered, "Lauren!" It was Calder's voice, but tighter, thinner, urgent in a way he hadn't allowed himself to sound earlier. I sat up straighter, my pulse rising. "Yes," I whispered. "What's wrong?" There was a beat of silence, the kind that tells you the next words will redraw the ground beneath your feet. I need you to listen carefully, he said. We've just uncovered something. You may want to sit down. I was already sitting, but I folded my arm across my stomach to steady myself, as though bracing for an impact. Calder exhaled shakily. I reviewed older records. A memo internal correspondence came through from 6 months ago, but it was deliberately buried after the meltdown began. It references your husband. The world narrowed. The lamp flickered once, almost imperceptibly. My voice scraped out of my throat. What memo? The line crackled faintly as though even the phone hesitated. Internal memo. CL88. Evidence number 6 in the chain. It shows that Mark accessed multiple accounts connected to dormant profiles, including your father's. Not once. Several times. And not coincidentally strategically. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Everything inside me went hollow and sharp at the same time, as if my body needed to create space for truth it had been resisting for months. Calder continued, his tone darkening. He didn't just stumble into restricted systems. He mapped them, tracked them, and positioned transactions around meltdown windows. And the timestamps, they line up with the inconsistencies you told me about. My heart hammered. So Lauren Calder interrupted gently but firmly, your husband is not peripheral to this investigation. He is at the center of it. The room felt suddenly smaller, as though the walls leaned inward. I pressed a hand to my forehead, my skin cold. This can't be right. There has to be something missing. There's nothing missing, he said. Only pieces you didn't have until now. I felt tears sting behind my eyes, not from sadness, but from the grim, hollow recognition of finally understanding what my body had tried to warn me about for days. Mark wasn't lying to avoid embarrassment. He was lying to protect something far darker. Lauren Calder said quietly, Are you home right now? Yes. Is he there? I hesitated, glancing around the room. No. He said he'd be at a late meeting. Good. Stay alert. Do not open the door for anyone you don't expect. A strange shiver crept across my spine. Calder. What aren't you telling me? Silence again. Too long. Too heavy. Then one of the accounts he accessed during the meltdown. It's a supervision channel, meaning he wasn't just moving money. He was watching someone. My breath caught. Watching who you? The word hit like a physical blow. I felt air slam out of my lungs, my heart free-falling in my chest. There were queries into your work credentials system, pathways you use, timestamps that match nights you felt something was off at home. He wasn't just stealing access, he was monitoring you. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. All the memories rushed at me at once. The trembling key, the shifted rug, the cologne that wasn't his scent, the nearly imperceptible shuffle behind the hallway wall, the half-open drawer that pretended not to be a violation the nights he said he was tired and went to bed early, but I heard the faint click of the door hours later. Lauren Calder asked softly. I'm here. I whispered, my voice barely audible. I'm here. I reached for the phone with my other hand, gripping it tightly just to feel something solid. Calder lowered his voice even further. There's more. My body tensed. What more? The memo. CL88 indicates that during the meltdown window, he used your father's card as a diversion. And you need to understand why. Why? My voice trembled. Calder hesitated. Because he needed a personal connection to the diversion. Something that would make investigators look at someone else first. Someone close. Someone trustworthy. My blood ran cold. "Me?" I whispered. "He used it so it would look like I—" "Yes," Calder said. "He was setting up a shadow trail pointing to your family, not himself." My throat tightened so painfully I pressed my fingers against it as though I could physically force the air back in. Lauren Calder said urgently, "Listen to me. The memo contradicts everything he's told you. This reversal changes the entire narrative." I leaned back against the couch, the world blurring at the edges. "Why would he do this to me?" "Because you were the perfect cover," Calder said. "Because you trusted him. Because you work in compliance and your proximity made the diversion more believable." I closed my eyes, a sickening wave of realization washing over me. He used me. Yes. The word was soft, but devastating. My hand shook. The phone's screen glowed up at me, reflecting faintly in the dark room. And then another reflection appeared, light shifting across my cheek, the noir object for this part phone light on cheek, a pale trembling glow that made my skin look unreal, almost ghost-like, as if I were watching myself from outside my own body. I felt the reflection deepen the moment, making it heavier, colder. Calder cleared his throat. "There's one more thing, and you need to hear it before I end this call." My skin prickled. "What?" "We've backtracked initial access logs to the earliest suspicious activity, and it predates your marriage." My chest constricted. "What?" "The first connection to your father's card happened before you were married to him. Years before. My entire world fissured. The pieces of my past rearranged themselves into a timeline I had never even imagined." "No," I whispered. "That can't be right." "It is." Then that means—" "Yes," Calder said quietly. "He didn't just betray you recently. He targeted you." I felt the room shift violently, my breath breaking in my chest. "Lauren." "I'm ending this call now," Calder said. "Sad. Lock your doors. Keep your phone on you. And if he contacts you, do not respond." The line clicked. Silence filled the room like smoke. I stared at the phone, the light still washing over my cheek, my pulse thundering so loudly I could hear it in my ears. And in that moment, illuminated by the cold, accusatory glow, I understood the second reversal with terrifying clarity. Mark hadn't changed. He had never been anything other than exactly who he was. The truth didn't break my world, it revealed the world he built around me. I returned home long after dark, moving through the shadows with the numb precision of someone whose emotions had been scraped raw, leaving only the mechanism of survival behind. The streets were slick with rain, the reflections on the pavement stretching thin across the asphalt like wounded ribbons of light, and by the time I reached the porch, the storm had tapered into a restless drizzle that tapped against the railing in a rhythm that made my skin prickle. I didn't turn on the porch light. I didn't want to see the house too clearly yet. I unlocked the door slowly, the metal clicking louder than usual, and stepped into the dim silence that waited like a held breath. The flickering bulb in the hallway, object number 10, the one that had framed the beginning of everything, buzzed faintly overhead, its unsteady glow sending shaky shadows across the walls. I stood beneath it for a long moment, letting the light stutter against my face, remembering how it had illuminated Mark's cruelty the night he told me to leave. Now it lit only me and the truth I carried. I moved through the house cautiously, not because I thought he was here, he wasn't, but because every room felt like a crime scene I hadn't known I'd been living inside. My shoes left faint damp marks on the hardwood floor, and each step echoed more loudly than the last. When I reached the kitchen table, I pulled out the final envelope from my bag, the one the audit team had handed me, with solemn, almost apologetic eyes. Report AX-301. Evidence number 8. The truth in its fullest, least merciful form. I set the thick packet on the table and sat down the chair, creaking beneath me in a way that sounded too human for the moment. The flickering bulb overhead cast intermittent flashes over the first page, making the print seem alive, pulsing faintly every time the filament struggled for breath. I inhaled deeply, steeling myself, then opened the report. Even the introduction felt like a blow. Final summary of account irregularities. Dormant card activity. Unauthorized access, and financial trail attribution. My eyes skimmed the lines until they caught on the first unmistakable fact. Mark had established a private hidden account tied to a shell corporation over 2 years before our wedding. Not after. Not during. Before. My heart lurched painfully as though it were trying to reject the information outright. The report detailed how he used the dormant card, the one belonging to my father, the one he should never have touched, to mask early transfers, testing the system for vulnerabilities. I felt nausea rise at the back of my throat. He had mapped the compliance structure of my department long before I ever introduced him to my coworkers. He had positioned himself to observe my routines, my patterns, my access points. He had built an entire trail of digital breadcrumbs designed to be traced back not to him, but to the people closest to me. My fingers trembled as I read on. The flickering bulb buzzed once, twice, then steadied for a long beat, as though the room itself wanted to witness the moment the truth fully carved itself into me. The report outlined the meltdown that triggered the investigation, a series of transactions routed through several dummy accounts, one of which was anchored by the dormant card. All the accounts except one were linked back to shell owners. All except one. The final account, numbered AX-301, traced directly to Mark. His name in the line of confirmed ownership made the air in the room compress, pressing cold and tight against my lungs. I stared at the letters, my pulse hammering painfully. It wasn't speculation. It wasn't suspicion. It wasn't circumstantial. It was absolute. The truth I had been circling for weeks now stood undeniable and immovable in front of me. I turned the page, my throat tight, as I read the next section. Linked events and behavioral correlations. It listed every inconsistency, every moment of unease, every timestamp mismatch. The 0317 withdrawal. The 0913 transaction on my father's card. The late nights. The access attempts. The use of my shadow credentials. The days he had been too tired, the nights he claimed insomnia, the times he had blamed stress, the moments he had made me question my memory, my instincts, my sanity. Each line cracked something deeper inside me. Then the punch I wasn't prepared for user activity suggests preparatory monitoring patterns aimed at personal proximity targets. Probable target Lauren Hale. The word target hit me like a fist to the sternum. I sucked in a shaky breath, the room tilting. The flickering bulb sputtered violently, then steadied again, throwing long shadows across the table that stretched like fractures in the wood. I pressed my palms flat against the surface, grounding myself. I had known pieces of the truth, yes. But seeing it documented, cold, clinical, irrefutable, stripped away every shield I'd tried to build around the remnants of my belief in him. Mark hadn't simply betrayed me. He had calculated me, built around me, designed around me. I was never his partner. I was the infrastructure of his plan. A noise outside startled me, a soft thump. Maybe a trash bin shifting in the wind, maybe something else, and my pulse jumped violently. I forced myself to focus back on the report. Another page. Another blow. Predicted intent diversion creation liability assignment and strategic concealment under domestic proximity cover. In other words, he planned to make it look like someone close to him, someone like me, had been involved. Not just for convenience, for strategy. My stomach clenched so hard I pressed a hand to my abdomen to steady myself. The bulb overhead flickered again, longer this time, the shadows shaking across the ceiling like something alive. I turned to the final page. The last entry was brutally short. Final determination. All evidence confirms intentional concealment by primary actor. Subject Mark Hale. Full responsibility attributable. I stared at those words until they blurred. Full responsibility attributable. But the damage he intended to cause to me, to my father, to my job, to my sanity, had already carved itself into my life. The report slipped from my fingers and landed on the table with a dull thud. I leaned back in the chair, every part of me trembling. I thought of the trembling key, the half-open drawer, the shifted rug, the cologne that wasn't his. I thought of his calm smile when he told me to leave the performance of innocence he perfected, the cold charm he wielded like a blade. I thought of how he had let me carry the weight of confusion while he sharpened the edges of a lie so vast it consumed everything it touched. The bulb buzzed again, then steadied, casting a stark, unwavering light over the table. For the first time in weeks, I felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not confusion, but a cold, crystalline clarity. The truth was complete now. Every thread traced, every mask removed, every shadow exposed. Evidence number 8 didn't just confirm what he had done, it confirmed who he had always been. The flickering bulb that once illuminated his cruelty now illuminated the truth he could never hide again. I didn't enter the conference room expecting calm, but I wasn't prepared for how quiet it actually was. The kind of quiet that feels manufactured, like someone had pressed a mute button on the world so the truth could hear itself more clearly. The glass wall behind the long table reflected everything with cold precision. Object number 11, stretching the room into 2 overlapping realities, the one where I stood breathing steadily, and the one where my reflection hovered behind me like a witness waiting to testify. I arrived early, intentionally needing the moment to gather myself before he walked in. The documents lay stacked in front of me in a neat line, each page a piece of the truth I had spent weeks piecing together. Evidence, patterns, timestamps, the flickering bulb from the night he pushed me out, the trembling key, the half-open drawer, the ATM slip, the meltdown memo, the audit mismatch, the final report. It all sat between us in silent accusation, even before he stepped through the door. When he finally entered, he did it with that same carefully curated calm he always wore, the kind that made strangers believe he was composed, rational, trustworthy. But I saw the tightness at the corners of his jaw, the flicker of recognition in his eyes, as he took in the tidy rows of folders on the table. He closed the door softly behind him, a deliberate gesture that felt less like courtesy and more like containment. "You wanted to meet," he said, his voice smooth but strained, the slightest crack hiding beneath the practiced tone. "I didn't sit. Not yet. I needed distance, emotional, physical, psychological, to hold myself steady." "I did," I replied, "because I want you to hear everything before you decide what you'll deny." His eyes narrowed not in anger, but in cautious calculation, the way someone looks when they realize the script they intended to use may no longer apply. I gestured to the chair across from me. "Sit." He hesitated. That hesitation alone told me more than any spoken answer could. But he eventually sat, folding his hands in front of him like a man preparing for negotiation rather than confession. The glass behind him caught the sharp line of his shoulders, his silhouette trembling faintly with each subtle flicker of light from the hallway. For a moment I watched the reflection instead of him, because the reflection didn't lie, didn't charm, didn't rearrange its features to suit the moment. It just showed him as he was, every angle, every shadow, every fracture. "We're done with pretending," I said quietly, sliding the first document toward him. He didn't reach for it. His eyes barely flicked downward. "Lauren." "I don't know what stop." My voice didn't rise, but it cut through the room with a clarity that surprised both of us. "You don't get to shape this." I lifted the document myself, flipping it open. Ref ZL47, my father's card, used at a location he's never visited. The slip was in his drawer. Clean edges, fresh ink, used during a pattern window you accessed years before we married. His jaw tensed. I continued, "ATM withdrawal at 03:17, machine A709. The same night you claimed you were home. The same night the house felt wrong. The same night you moved so quietly I didn't hear you leave." His breath stuttered just barely, enough to confirm he remembered, enough to tell me he'd hoped I wouldn't. I placed the next document on the table. Statement W22. "Jessa saw your phone. The notification. The mismatch. The screenshot you tried to hide." His fingers twitched slightly. A small muscle near his eye pulsed. "Lauren, you're misunderstanding. I'm not finished." I reached for the next file. Alert code 511R, found in our drawer. A drawer you lied about opening. A drawer you tried to leave looking undisturbed. Wrong again. The next. Timestamp contradiction. You told me mid-morning. It was 03:17. You weren't where you said you were. You weren't doing what you said you were doing. The next. Internal memo CL88. You accessed dormant accounts strategically. More than once. The next. Security audit mismatch RM04. Shadow credentials. Attempted access under my name. From our home. His face shifted, then finally something flickered across it that wasn't charm or calculation. Something sharp. Something cornered. Something real. I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice to the level of a blade's whisper. You didn't just lie to me. You didn't just steal. You built a version of me that made your crimes possible. His breath quickened. Lauren? No. I cut him off again. You planned this. You targeted me before we even married. You used my father. You used my job. You used my trust. My hand moved to the final file, the thick one, the one that had burned my fingertips just hours before. Report AX301. Your account, your name, your responsibility. I slid it toward him. It stopped against his folded hands. He didn't push it away. He didn't pull it closer. He just stared at it, the reflection of the document trembling faintly in the glass wall behind him, splitting into two blurred shadows over his shoulder. For the first time since all of this began, he looked unsteady. Not guilty. He wasn't the kind of man shaped by guilt, but exposed. The kind of exposure a carefully built life can't withstand. Why I asked the word quiet, but heavy enough to pull the air down with it. He blinked his throat working, searching for a story he could still shape. But the room didn't give him space for lies anymore. Not with the evidence laid out. Not with the glass behind him reflecting everything twice, making deception harder to disguise. Eventually, slowly, painfully, he exhaled, and the truth slipped out in a voice stripped of pretenses. Because you trusted me, not an apology, not regret, a confession, a motive, a worldview, a weapon. My chest tightened, not with shock, but with the cold recognition of the answer I had already known. He leaned back slightly, the chair creaking under his weight, his reflection splitting into twin shadows mirroring the shift. You made it easy, he added quietly. You believed what I said. You didn't look where you weren't supposed to. The words hollowed something out inside me, carving a space that hurt more than anger ever could. And my father, I whispered. He was convenient, he said. And you. His voice broke off as he realized what he was admitting. But it didn't matter. I had heard enough. I had heard everything. The glass reflection behind him began to stabilize as the hallway light steadied the trembling silhouette, smoothing into clearer shapes. It was the beginning of the motif resolve, the moment clarity begins to replace distortion. My voice came out steady, colder than I felt. This is over. With you, with the lies, with the pieces of my life you thought you could arrange like furniture. He didn't move. The silence grew taut between us. Then I said the last thing he didn't expect, words that weren't loud or dramatic, but weighted with something he had never accounted for. I'm not afraid of you anymore. His eyes widened slightly, not in anger, in realization. The reflection behind him, our silhouettes aligned in one clean, unbroken line across the glass. No fracture, no distortion. No shadow splitting the truth. The moment clarity returned was the moment his control shattered, and he felt it in the quiet more deeply than he ever felt victory in noise. I woke before the sun, not because of fear anymore, but because the world finally felt quiet in a way that didn't demand explanations or apologies. The house held a stillness I hadn't felt since long before everything broke. An honest stillness, not the rehearsed kind that used to hide someone else's movements behind its silence. I stood in the living room for a long moment, letting my eyes adjust to the faint gray light that seeped through the half-closed curtain, the air cool and crisp like a fresh page I hadn't dared believe I would ever get to turn. When I reached for the table lamp, my fingers brushed the broken frame I'd found the night before, after returning from the confrontation. Its glass had shattered cleanly, not violently, just a quiet break that felt strangely symbolic, as though the universe had marked the exact moment the truth stopped being fractured and became clear. I crouched and picked up one of the shards, object number 12, its sharp edge reflecting a thin ribbon of early light across my palm. The mirror shard was cold, but its clarity steadied me, showing a reflection that didn't shake, didn't tremble, didn't distort. For the first time in weeks, months, maybe even years, the reflection looking back at me was mine, unbroken, uncompromised. I stood with the shard in my hand, holding it just close enough to see one single line of light form along its surface. And with that, the motif resolve settled. The reflection settles into one clear line. I let those words form silently in my mind, feeling them click into place like a lock, finally turning after too many years stuck. The house didn't feel haunted anymore. The shadows weren't hiding warnings. They were just shadows. Normal shadows. I walked to the window and opened the curtain a few inches wider, letting a fresh wash of morning light slip inside. Outside, the world looked almost indifferent. Cars passing, neighbors leaving for work, someone jogging with a dog that barked lazily at a passing bird. Life was moving without hesitation, and for the first time I felt ready to move with it. I made coffee, slowly savoring the sound of water boiling, the smell of the grounds, the quiet drip into the mug. Each small sensation felt like a confirmation that my life, my space, my breath belonged to me again. No false explanations looping through my head, no mental calculations matching timestamps against lies, no trembling reflections hinting at truths I wasn't ready to see. My phone buzzed once on the counter. I flinched out of habit. Months of conditioning don't disappear overnight, but when I looked, it wasn't him. It never would be again. It was a text from Calder. Report filed. Official proceedings underway. You're clear, Lauren. Completely. I didn't realize how tightly I'd been holding my breath until the message loosened something deep inside my ribs. I leaned against the counter, exhaling slowly, the steam from my coffee brushing against my face like a reminder that the world wasn't made of sharp edges anymore. Not every moment was a test. Not every silence was a trap. I moved to the sofa, sitting exactly where I had been the night he called, where the phone light had struck my cheek like a cold omen. But now the room felt warmer, softer, almost gentle. A simple, honest quiet. I placed the mirror shard on the table in front of me, watching how the light curved around it. Then I pressed my palm flat against the fabric of my rain-soaked coat, now fully dried, draped neatly over the chair where I'd left it after returning yesterday. That coat had carried so much weight through the storm, through the truth, through the confrontation, but now it was just a coat, nothing more. I let my thoughts drift back to the conference room, to the reflection that had finally aligned to the moment he realized he no longer had power over the narrative or over me. The memory didn't sting. It didn't burn. It didn't hollow me. It just existed, a closed chapter. A truth learned. A truth passed. I sipped my coffee. The taste was steady grounding. I looked around the living room, the framed photos, the books aligned unevenly on the shelf, the plant leaning slightly toward the window. Ordinary things. Mine. All mine. My life hadn't ended when the truth emerged. It had begun. I rose from the sofa, walking toward the hallway, the floor warm beneath my feet from the sunlight edging its way inside. I paused beneath the flickering bulb out of instinct, but it didn't flicker now. It glowed steady and sure, a quiet promise that nothing hidden lurked in its light anymore. I reached up and touched the base of the bulb, lightly feeling its small hum of warmth. Not the stutter of something broken, just the steady pulse of something true. And with that, the final piece of the motif resolve clicked through me like a soft exhale. Clarity doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives in the exact moment you realize silence no longer frightens you. I moved through the house freely, touching objects I hadn't touched in weeks, reclaiming the space one small gesture at a time. When I reached the door, the memory of him standing there, calm, cruel, rehearsed, brushed the edges of my mind, but it didn't pull me under. It didn't make my breath falter. It simply reminded me that the doorway was no longer a threshold between fear and confusion. It was just a door, just wood, just hinges, just mine. I opened it and stepped outside, letting the morning air wrap around me with its cool steadiness. The sky was brightening to a pale blue, the kind that promises a quiet day without demanding anything in return. I walked down the porch steps, slowly savoring the feel of the world greeting me without shadows. No fractured reflections, no trembling distortions, no hidden footsteps. Just light, just clarity, just me. When the reflection finally held steady, so did I.